Hi, I'm Catlin Goodrow, and I'm going to be talking about fluency and confidence in special education. Although, really, the strategies I'm going to be talking about, I've used with students across the educational spectrum. Um, and a couple words about me, oh, if I can make the slides advance, that is. Um, so I am an intervention teacher and literacy coach in Spokane, Washington. I taught first and second grades when I was a classroom teacher. But then when I went into the intervention teaching setting, I taught third through fifth graders primarily, and really had to sort of cobble together the routines that would work for those grade levels. I knew a lot about the science of reading for younger students, um, but I felt like the resources were not as collected for upper elementary. And so I ended up writing a book about what I found and what I ended up doing in my classroom. It's called Reading Beyond the Basics: Key Routines for Engaging Research-Informed Instruction in Grades 2 through 6. Everyone's got to love a long subtitle. Um, and I consider myself a bird nerd. I became a birder during the pandemic, like a lot of people, and I'm a word nerd. I love phonics and morphology, word games. I listened to a whole book yesterday about the decipherment of cuneiform writing. So I'm a big nerd when it comes to writing in words. Um, and so I'm going to talk about a specific group of students that I worked with and three routines that I used to build their fluency. But a little bit of background about my students. We instituted a what I need or win block this year. And so it was a real team approach that basically all of us are responsible for all of our students. And during that time, that was when we had our pullouts for special education, intervention, multilingual learners, gifted and talented. And I ended up teaching a group of five fifth graders. At the beginning of the year, three of them had IEPs or individualized education plans with goals around reading fluency, and two without, but they were in the process of qualifying. By the end of the year, all five had qualified for special education. And in the first semester, we were doing the rewards program, which is a word reading program written by Anita Archer. And then in the semester two, we did a novel study, and that's what I'm going to talk about, the routines that I used during that novel study. And so in moving from doing a really structured program, which rewards is an explicit, structured program, direct instruction, into a novel, I was thinking about research that's been happening since around 2000, showing that students can grow more when given more challenging texts, um, as long as we provide them with support. We once had an idea that sort of students should read text at their level. I think with the coming of the Common Core, we now know, or we were all challenged to move kids into more challenging text and didn't always get support in what it meant to scaffold that challenging text for students. And so that was what I was really researching when I went into the intervention space. Um, a one caveat, though, for using challenging text is that students should be reading at least a second grade level. Um, and that if they are, you can support them in reading text 2 to 4 grade levels above their reading level, with air quotes. Um, and so, even though my students this year were all qualified for special education, we read fifth grade text in the intervention setting in order to give them that support with what they would see at grade level, which was it was actually interesting because their teachers took a more instructional level text approach in their reading class. So they were actually reading more challenging text in the intervention setting with me than they were in their grade level classroom. So it really was the opportunity that they had during the day to read on grade level. And if you're just curious about this research into challenging text, I have a whole slide of references at the end of the slideshow, which you're going to get after the symposium today. And one of the reasons why it's important to read challenging text and that all students get an opportunity to engage with grade level text is that it takes advantage of the implicit learning system. So we can learn things explicitly by being directly taught, but the implicit system occurs automatically without conscious awareness or intention, and it involves many kinds of information in addition to language. It can be called statistical learning because basically it's taking advantage of your brain's pattern seeking. It's your pattern seeking abilities that are automatic. And so if you're like, wait a second, this kind of sounds like that whole language stuff that we're moving beyond. I think that when I first heard about this, Mark Seidenberg, who's quoted here, um, wrote a blog post that really shook people when he said that we were teaching too much phonics explicitly. Um, but when I thought about this and really wanted to try it, um, what I had to think about was which kids are ready for this. And so I looked at whether my kids were generating the ability to read words that they had not specifically been taught the phonics patterns for. And when I could see that in their reading, then I would know that they are ready to move into this challenging grade level text and start taking more advantage of this implicit learning. If you're not listening to your kids read all the time, you might not know whether that they are ready for this. So you need to make sure that you're building in time to actually hear them read. So I'm going to share the data of my group of 5 students here, and then I'll tell you what we did to get there. So our average fluency growth was 19 points, or 19 words per minute from the beginning of the year. And their average accuracy moved from around the 93% level to 97%. And you can see here that students generally had growth in the 80s to 90th percentiles. However, there was this one student whose growth was much lower than the other students. And when we get into talking about decoding, um, I'll talk about what I think was going on there. So I used 3 main strategies in our group. Having really clear routines that you do over and over again ensures that cognitive load is on the text and not on activities sort of around the text. So the 3 routines I used were called a strategic preview. During reading, I used the phase reading routine, and I I taught them a decoding routine as well, for challenging words. And then during and after reading, I used a routine that I called text tracking, to facilitate memory and comprehension of the text. So the first routine that I used was strategic preview. In this routine, I set a purpose for reading by asking a question and gave a quick 3 to 7 minute overview of content that might be a barrier to student understanding of the text content. And so, what is really important with this routine and all of the routines is the reading that the teacher does before the actual lesson. So, this is a shot of the actual book that we were reading and some of the notations that I made. So, I would go through for in my first read, I underline all the things that I thought might be barriers to understanding or barriers to fluency because these kids were working on their fluency. And so then in the phase reading strategy, the teacher and the students uh, take turns reading. And so I would go through the text and indicate by just writing initials where each student was going to read. And I would tailor the section to their ability. So one of my students here, CH, uh, she had a lot more decoding challenges than some of the other students. So I would carefully pick the section that she was going to read based on that need. And then here where it says T, that's where I would read. If the barriers, like here, I underlined the word embroidered and I underline the word riotous, but those are in the section that I'm going to read. So I don't need to preview those. I can just, if it's a challenging word, I can just define it quickly as I'm reading. Or if it's difficult to pronounce, I'm going to be the one reading it. So from this section, I picked out what's the main purpose that students are going to need to understand from the section we read, and then what are the barriers to understanding that I needed to preview. And so where you see these purple and pink slides or plain white slides, these are the actual slides from my classroom. And so I'm just going to give you a quick little 5 minutes about or less than 5 minutes, 1 minute about the book that we read, because it will help if you know a little bit about it. So we were reading The Last Hope School for Magical Delinquents by Nikki Pau-Preto. It's a magic school book in the vein of Harry Potter about Vin, who has been expelled from every magic school she's ever been to because she cannot control her magic. So she gets sent to the sort of last chance alternative school for magical delinquents, where she learns to control her magic and finds a group of people who understand her. And so in this section, we were just reading about 4 pages, um, and the chapter is called Not Alone. So then in this part, she realizes she's not alone. So our purpose question was based around this quote. It said, Vin decided to wear her friends like armor. What does this mean, and what does it tell us about how Vin's life is changing? I picked that as the purpose because it was key to understanding the book. It's all about how she finds a chosen family, but also because this phrase, decided to wear her friends like armor, had a double meaning. She was actually surrounded by her friends, and that was the meaning that the kids got explicitly. But they did not get the more symbolic meaning until we had a conversation about it. So, knowing that that was maybe going to be a barrier to deeper understanding, I made it the purpose for our lesson that day. And then I picked 3 words. So we moved into word reading practice. These are words that in my pre-reading, they're going to be in sections that a student was reading and that could be difficult for them to read. So we used our word reading routine, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment, to read these words. Here's another example of a preview, this one a vocabulary preview. In the section, it said that Vin had an ominous feeling. So I defined the word ominous, giving a sign of future trouble. The ominous cloud signaled a storm was coming. And our purpose for reading then was, why does Vin feel that the situation is ominous? I also sometimes would preview idioms that might be barriers to understanding, or in some sections where there were concepts that were difficult. There was a there's a taxidermy toucan that is significant in the book, so we previewed what taxidermy was. Now, if the toucan was not significant to the book, I probably wouldn't preview that. I would just skim over it and maybe define it for students in the moment. But because it is a sort of character that comes up again and again, I did preview it. So you really want to, I call it a strategic preview because you really want to think what's going to be important to the overall understanding. So then the two routines I would use during reading are phase reading and a decoding routine. And phase reading is fluent, accountable, social, and expressive. I learned about it from Doug Lemov, and just from his Twitter feed. He posted videos of it. And this was something I was a little hesitant to try because it is a routine where the teacher reads aloud and students follow. And then at pre-planned stops, a teacher calls on a student to read. So I might say, pick up Elliot. And at the end of the planned section, the teacher reads or asks another student to read. Why I was a little hesitant was I'd always heard, you don't want to do popcorn reading, and this felt a little bit like that. But some teachers that I really trusted, like Sean Morrissey, who's presenting today, had been using it with great success. And I know in our panel later, we're going to talk about tinkering in the classroom. This was something that I saw people were having success with it. It was a low barrier to entry for me. I could try it a couple times, and if it didn't work, it we could read a different way. But it turned out to be very successful because it was a safe group. They were all working on fluency and they'd been working on it together all year. They knew that they could make errors and that that was a safe place to do that. Kids started asking to read more. They started asking, can I be the first one to read? And so it really did start building their confidence early on. They did tell me, though, that they liked to read in my group because it was a safe place. They would not have liked to do it in a larger classroom. What I've heard some teachers do for students who are striving readers in the general ed class is they'll actually preview and practice the section that they're going to read and have had good results with that. And then I also used a decoding routine. It's adapted from the one in rewards and also from the work of Devin Kearns. And so the point of a decoding routine is to get kids to look at the vowels or word parts, break the word down, and reassemble it. So we'd start by dotting the vowels or vowel teams, which gives them a sense of just how many syllables there are going to be. Then look for words or word parts you know, circle them. Some people just say prefixes or suffixes. I have found it's helpful to just be flexible about that. Kids will break down the words in different ways, and that's okay. Then they read each part slowly, read the whole word smoothly, and ask themselves, is it a word? If not, flex the sounds. or the way Anita Archer says it is make it a real word. So how that looks is like this. We have the word that we're previewing. We dot the, oh, sorry. We dot the vowels and then circle the parts we know. So they would know D and ED because we had learned about those word parts in rewards. And then they would only have to blend this middle part. So they would say D, and it's very likely that they would say skinned, ed, discended. And then you have to think flexibly, make it a real word, descended. So I told you I would talk about the student who had lower growth than the others. And I think one of the barriers for this student was that she had a smaller vocabulary than the other students. So she could read all the parts of the word, but make it a real word was really challenging for her because she just didn't have a bank of words to draw on that was as large as the other students. So at the very end, I'll talk about what I'm thinking about that for next year. And then the final routine, I call text tracking. I kind of had to figure this routine out on my own. There wasn't a lot of research out there about how to support kids in memory of longer text. There was, however, some research on integrating information across text. So from that, I saw that having kids create representations of text structures and relationships is high leverage. So I recreated this routine, which is just co-creating visual representations of important information from the text. And we typically did that after reading, but I'm going to show you a during reading example. So in the book, The Last Hope School for Magical Delinquents, there is a sort of magical game of capture the flag that happens, and it's really dense with action, lots of different minor characters doing things, different magical powers being used to try and win this game. And so I just had two students come up to the board. One represented one team and the other represented the other team. And as I read this whole section because it was so dense. They drew what was happening. And so I would pause um, sometimes for them to draw the action, and they came up with this sort of like Cy Twombly-esque drawing here. But it really helped them to understand what was happening so that when we stopped reading on a cliffhanger where everyone was in mortal peril, they knew what was going on and they could understand and then remember it for the next day because we were going to come back after a cliffhanger. Sort of a more typical way I've used text tracking is we would track the big questions we had and then write in the answers. So here they asked, does Vin have more than one power? And when we found the answers, we wrote it in. This was just on a chart paper that we would hang and add to. And then here's an example of so they had this big question about what was going on with the character of Vin. Did she have more than one power? You can see in the top, there's that question. And we had this tracker of what were the different magical abilities of different characters. And so when we found out that the main character, Vin, was able to absorb other people's powers, and she was called a chameleon. They ran up to the board and, without even any prompting, they got a sticky note and they wrote Vin and they put her in the middle of the all the different magical abilities. So the text tracking really supports their comprehension, and it creates more engagement in the text. They were super excited to answer their questions, um, and to continue the representation of the text. And so we're getting close on time. So what were the qualitative results and takeaways I had? It was more confidence at the beginning of the year. Some of the students had just qualified for special education. They did not want to be there. Um, and they just became more confident. Parents and teachers noticed it. Students were happier to come to group. They asked to read more. They wanted to read when I was absent. They would say things like, Disney has to make this into a show. Um, and then my other takeaways for students who had gaps in knowledge, like my student who had just lower vocabulary, growth was slower. And we are piloting two different vocabulary programs for Tier 1 next year to help alleviate some of that pressure. And if you want to learn more about strategic previews, decoding multisyllabic words, or text tracking, I write about all three of those routines in more depth about how to plan and execute them in my book, Reading Beyond the Basics. But if you want to learn more about phase reading, you can go to Doug Lemav's book, The Teach Like a Champion Guide to the Science of Reading, or just the Teach Like a Champion blog. And there are videos of phase reading there. Um, I love to, when people get in touch with me, so you can email me. I'm at Evidently R on Twitter and Blue Sky. My website's evidentlyreading.com. And so now I can stop sharing. And if you have any questions, let us know. No questions. I must have been exceptionally clear. So the question is, were there any English learners in their group? There wasn't in this particular group, but I have used all the same routines in with English learners as well. The questions is, did you find that rewards was beneficial to start the year with prior to moving to the novel study? I did think it was beneficial. It was hard to execute because you really need 40 minutes for the lessons. And if you have 40 minutes 5 days a week, it's a 6 week program. We did not have that. So it took the entire semester. Um, but it is fairly dry, so finding ways to make it more engaging is really important as well. Any other questions out there? Um,
The slides, do we, how do we access them?
I believe that after the symposium, you will get like an email that has a link to all the slides from today. I know that I have sent them off to the symposium planners to be passed along to you. What was my student to teacher ratio? So I have about typically between 3 to 6 students in a group. This one was 5. Um, and so um, typically I like 5 to 6. I know some people enjoy smaller groups, but I find it can be a little bit more challenging actually with fewer students. So, this is a really good question. Katie says, I find that the pre-teach takes a lot of time due to the low levels of my students. When do you decide the text might be too difficult despite trying to expose them to texts above their level? Um, so that's sort of two questions there. One is, how do we keep that pre-teach within the amount of time? I really, so the research on this is that even 5 to 7 minutes improves comprehension. So if you think, okay, I'm going to give 5 minutes and that's all I'm going to give, then what is most important for students to understand to read this section, chapter, article, chemistry textbook, etc. So you really carefully select that material. And that's why I find it's helpful to have the reading purpose beforehand. So I typically read it, plan the purpose question, and then think, okay, to answer this question, what do students need to know? And really restrict the preview to that. Now, I might address quickly while I'm reading, like say the definition of a word they don't know, but I just say that as an aside. My students also, they've known me for a long time. They're very comfortable about just asking me stuff that they don't know. Um, and so then the second question is really, how do you decide the text might be too difficult? Um, so number one is that point that I said earlier about, are they able to generate words that they have never seen or have not been explicitly taught the patterns for? If not, then we need to do some backup. So with kids who are really even farther behind, even in fourth or fifth grade, we might do U fly with them because it's more basic phonics. Um, for grade level text, one idea that has been helpful for my teachers is what they call text engineering. And it's not lowering the level of the text, but it's adding things like subheadings, captions, visuals that can support comprehension and make the text more coherent. That's also a lot easier to do with AI these days. So we'll just like, if it's an article or science article, we'll copy it in a document and then add those headings or visuals to make it more coherent. Sometimes we'll add a glossary. It takes a little bit of time, but the teachers I coach have found it really helpful. Any other questions out there? Great. Well, we're getting done 5 minutes early. Um, Virginia, do you have anything you need to add?
Miss Goodrow, I have a quick question for you.
Great.
So, for you said how the phase reading is different from popcorn reading, but what do you think? What are the benefits of phase where you specifically tell the student to read that particular, paragraph, whereas in popcorn reading, everybody, moves on from where the previous student had left. So, what is the main benefit of this phase reading, according to you?
So I think the main difference is that I've pre-planned who is going to read what. And really a lot of the focus is on being expressive. Um, and so they're getting a little bit of a chance to almost like perform. Um, but I've chosen the section that I know that they will be able to read it and be successful with it. Um, and so I had one student who was really great at the expression. So when there was like an important dialogue section, she would be reading that. Excuse me, I had one student who was a little bit, who I mentioned had a little bit more of a decoding struggle. So I would pick sections that I knew she could decode most of the words. Because the students were all working on fluency, all of them had words that they needed to pause to decode. Um, but I think phase reading is just more controlled and planned than popcorn reading.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great questions.
Catlin, thank you so much. There were so many big takeaways. For me, even with a different grade, it was a great learning curve. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. And if anyone thinks of questions, feel free to email me. You'll get the slides that has my information on it, or just drop me a message on social media as well.